Hey 3DMJers, this is Andrea Valdez, and you're listening to the 3D Muscle Journey podcast. But before we get into the show, I have to tell you guys a slightly embarrassing but very funny story about this episode, or I think it's funny. Anyways, so we have Jeff, Eric, and Brad on this episode, right? And the four of us usually start out our little Skype call, catch up with each other for a bit, lightly touch on the topic and where we want the show to go, and then we start the recording. But on this particular call, Brad's Skype software had just updated, so he was checking out all the features, testing a few of the functions, and stumbled upon some of the new fun backgrounds that you can apply to the call. And although we're playing around with all that for a few minutes, of course we switched back to the normal window pane view thing before we started the recording. But for some crazy reason, Brad's screen recording did not switch back, and it turns out that in his video file the whole time, we're still saved as like four tiny passengers on an empty plane ride just hanging out across the aisle from each other. So if you're watching this on YouTube, that's what the heck is going on. That's why you'll see Jeff and Eric normally podcasting, and then also a little row of tiny airline passengers just having a good chat next to each other about nutrient timing. So that's all. Sorry you don't see Brad up close in this episode. Sorry you're just staring at the top of my head the whole time while I'm writing because I wasn't supposed to be in this one. But I'm also not sorry that you'll get to see us in our little podcasting flight because I honestly think it's hilarious and I hope you guys are okay with it. So anyway, just wanted to give you guys a heads up if you like watching the show on video. I'll let the guys take it from here. Please enjoy our podcast all about nutrient timing with Brad Loomis, Jeff Alberts, and Eric Helms.
What's going on, 3DMJers? We're back with another 3DMJ podcast. I'm joined by 3DMJ coaches Brad Loomis and Jeff Alberts, and we're talking today about nutrient timing and meal distribution. Is it a new topic? No, but believe it or not, it's relatively new to the 3DMJ podcast. We haven't talked about this in depth for its own podcast episode, but we have talked about it tangentially, and we thought it was definitely deserving of a more in-depth discussion. As your chief science officer, which I love because it reminds me of Star Trek as a title, I think this is a fun one to talk about because the research is, while some who are more quantitative minded, more analytical, they might not really like the research on this topic because it's not definitive. It doesn't give you a clear set of guidelines. It's a relatively messy and semi-ambiguous nature when you look at all the data. But I like that because it also doesn't show like extreme differences between studies, like, oh, this one had a negative effect, this one a positive, what do I make of that? More so, it's just a lot of not very strong effects, which I think those are opportunities to talk about it outside of the scientific context because it probably indicates that there are substantial individual differences. And it probably indicates that we have a fair amount of flexibility and that other non-quote-unquote quantitative physiological outcomes are going to take precedence, like your personal preferences, what works with your life schedule, etc. And I know these two gentlemen have some really good thoughts on how can we leverage different structures and approaches and mindsets related to how we distribute our meals to enhance the likelihood of success, adherence, and long-term habit development, which I think we've all established now is pretty damn important for having long-term sustainability in this bodybuilding game. So that's my intro. Jeff, let's start with you. Like when you think about first setting up a nutrition protocol for someone, whether that's a Skype client who you're talking through and chatting through for the first time, or whether you're working with a bodybuilder who has some things that they're doing. What are some of the big rocks and what are you trying to establish and what do you see the importance of this conversation for?
Well, I first want to start by saying I'm really glad we're not going to be getting too sciencey because I didn't do good in high school in science. So I'm glad that we can, basically utilize 35 years worth of bodybuilding experience to kind of talk about this stuff.
Well, Jeff, let me just also say that you may have not done well in English either, but we'll just leave it there.
I didn't,
you did
and
good.
That's why I don't start off with the introductions to the podcast. So it kind of reminds me of one guy that I knew that had a seventh grade education, started his own cement business, and now he has a fat house up on the hill. So, but anyways, but yeah, so the question being like, how do I start someone off? So I think the big thing is establishing something where someone can actually adhere really well and can sustain it. So adherence and sustainability, I think, is the biggest things that I think about when setting someone up. And of course, to get something on paper that I want to start, it's diving into their context, like really breaking down, a lot of their past history around food, their eating styles, what they enjoy, that type of thing, and just really starting from that type of framework. And of course, we can kind of look at, each individual macronutrient and see which one might be, quote unquote, best based off of maybe some real data that we have. But that's kind of how I think about it in the beginning, is just really collecting data on each person and diving in.
No, I think that's great. Despite not having done well in high school, my friend, you have the ethos of a scientist there. You're trying to collect data and get a normative value before you go around mucking with things and trying to figure out what is and isn't working, and approaching each individual like a case study. So I think that applies to far more than just this topic, and it's part of one of the many reasons, my friend, why you're a great coach.
A+, from the best science teacher out there. I'll take it.
Oh, you stop it. This is just the mutual admiration podcast, folks. Hey, Brad, same question to you, buddy. Where do you view this when you start touching down with a client, and what do these conversations look like? How do you frame them? And what's your kind of entrance point with a client when you start talking about this topic?
Jeff hit it on the head, to be honest with you. I want to get out of them, how they're currently going about their business, and see if there's any red flags, more so than anything. Somebody tells me that, they're eating twice a day, they're eating a small breakfast and then kind of piling in everything else at dinner. That's a little bit of a red flag, Likewise, having somebody tell me, well, I eat 8 meals a day, so that I can keep the metabolism cranking, and I'm not going to make fun of that because, yours truly was guilty of that, of years 2003 through like 2008, but a lot of times what's
Brad,
hard.
I only did 6 meals because I can't count to 8.
The highest frequency your math numbers will allow.
Shoot, Jeff, now you made me lose my train of thought. What was I going to say? I'm 50 and a half now, man. You can't do that anymore.
You were talking about how if your clients are on either one of the extremes of low or high meal frequencies, you see that as a red flag, and you're talking about red flags in general. I got you.
Oh, yes. And okay, that's what I was going to talk about. So sometimes it's hard to get from somebody what it is they're actually doing and what they think we want to hear. You know what I mean? And so, like, just circling back to what Jeff just said, I want to find out what it is that they're doing, because trying to find some sort of adherence, it's going to have to kind of somewhat look like what it is that they're doing now, but we might just have to modify things a little bit, because for continued success, we always have to have these two worlds merge and kind of come together to where we kind of take what their existing framework is, that is probably something that they've been doing for years, and it's easy for them to adhere to, and just make minute changes to the other world of, being quote unquote optimal and what evidence says, and et cetera, and then make that a plan for them that, sets them up for success, instead of doing, like we used to do so many years ago. You have to get, this many meals, this amount of carbs in each meal, and this spread of fat. That's not really setting up somebody for success. So that's what I a lot of times do. I listen, absorb. What is it that they're doing now? What have they continued to do? What's worked for them, and then merge that together as much as I can with the world of evidence, and try to come up with a plan that is a nice balance between the two.
I think quite often people don't really have anything they're actually adhering to. So oftentimes you have some people, they're just all over the place. Like one day it might look like one meal, another day it might look four, another day it's two, and calories are just all over the place. So there's really no structure, not even a foundation that they're actually working from. So again, when you dissect and ask a bunch of questions, you kind of learn this and you realize, okay, whether it's I'm setting someone up with 2 meals a day or 4 or 5, whatever the case may be, there needs to be some type of foundation and structure put in place in order for them to kind of, take that first step and work from. So that's what I kind of come across quite often with, people who are, let's say, a little bit greener, or just a little less structured outside of the bodybuilding world.
Mm-hmm. Those are oftentimes, that to me, the people that seem like they're the most moldable, because they can do either or, because they've done it for so long. Monday and Tuesdays one way, and Saturday, Sunday's another way, and it's easier to get them into a little bit more of a sound structure that is a little bit more like we say, or like we claim that the evidence shows works the best,
Mm-hmm. Well, so there's actually two really useful things that you guys are talking about that I think it would be helpful for people to get some maybe constraints around what we do know. Like what kind of evidence do we have on this? Is one, Jeff, you brought up that sometimes there's just a simple lack of structure. And I think for relatively obvious reasons, it's good to have a structure because it, facilitates adherence. So long as it is not overly rigid, which we've talked about many times, can cause issues. And then, Brad, you talked about, someone might be eating 8 meals a day to quote unquote stoke the metabolism. So there's another thing that does sometimes occur is that people come to us with preconceived notions. So they think there is a way to do things in this topic or this realm that you have to carefully, educate them about and talk to them and interrogate, not that you're interrogating them, but you're interrogating the topic of trying to figure out, why do they believe that? How strongly is that held belief? How long have they been doing this? And how open are they to that belief being challenged? And I think most of the time people are coming to 3DMJ because they have some level of trust in our ability to leverage our experience and our knowledge of the evidence that, hey, if there is something you're doing that's not in line or it's unnecessary, we can guide you otherwise. So I don't think that's a huge barrier. But I do remember 2010, 11, we're not that known of a quantity. The research is less developed. The evidence-based community isn't as well established. And, the concepts of flexible dieting were not really mainstream yet. And it was a challenge sometimes because, who's this kid? Who's this Eric Helms guy trying to tell me to do things differently? And I learned kind of the hard way that I can't just be like, well, doesn't this study convince you, or doesn't this logic convince you? Like, I have to actually have an understanding of where they're emotionally attached to something rather than just logic them out of it, because that can come across as condescending or even disrespectful to how they felt they've got from point A to point B. So anyway, if you gentlemen don't mind, can I talk through some of the science that we do have on this that gives us some admittedly broad constraints, but some constraints for how we can form this structure and the things that maybe we need to disabuse people of notions that they might think?
I wasn't ready for this in high school, but I think I've matured enough now where I can actually sit through and learn something along with the listeners. So yeah, by all means.
Absolutely. Okay, cool.
Yeah, and it's really good because it gives the listeners an idea of what it is that we're trying to work toward, and just checking off as many boxes as what you're going to talk about there.
Absolutely. So I think the first thing to know is that context is key. Many times when you listen to the anecdotes of some of the more popular bodybuilding voices, they are coming from the enhanced side. So if we think about, what do you have to do to get to 260 pounds, contest shape or something like that, or the equivalent for someone's height or sex or what have you. Like when we think about who is going to be in the most dominant voices in the broader bodybuilding community, which is where a lot of these beliefs started. We have to, I know your immediate thought is, well, anabolic steroids, but anabolic steroids they're not magic. They allow you to get more muscle mass. You still have to feed that. So if you're 5'6" and you're able to get on stage shredded at 230, that means you're like 260 in the off season. Think about what you have to do. Eating becomes a job. So this anecdote of people eating 6, 7, 8 times a day probably has far more to do with the logistics and the GI discomfort and the necessity of how do I get my body this large, especially if you also come from a community that has a relatively rigid food use. Like I have 4 carb options at each meal. I'm eating, oats or potatoes or rice, and like if you are not kind of accustomed to the idea of having more liberal food selection and foods that are a little easier on the gut, that are quote unquote dirty instead of quote unquote clean, then you have to even more think about, oh my God, how am I going to get this all in? So if you think about like the 1990s and the 2000s, where a lot of these kind of quote unquote bro science myths started, they're not necessarily wrong. It's just what was ascribed to them might be incorrect. So is it boosting the metabolism? Not necessarily. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and say no, and I'll explain why with some data. But do you think Dorian Yates eating the foods he got to could have gotten there with, a 2 meal per day thing? Like, no. Like, no one can eat 3,000 calories in one sitting, except for after they did the show. And then what happens? They're ready to burst, right? And that's not a day-to-day strategy. And no, you ain't definitely going to go do a blood and guts workout after that. So I think there's some context there. So, but there's also some, as there often is, we often think of bro science as the other side of the coin to science. Many times it is just old science that's been repeated, and you have telephone and was maybe taken out of context, and maybe we were trying to make firm conclusions off of limited data. So if I recall correctly, I think the actual idea of stoking the metabolism did come from the peer-reviewed literature. There was and I don't have this study offhand, but I think there was like a case study of a boxer that was done where this one measurement of one person using, less than perfect methods suggested higher energy expenditure when eating more frequent meals than less. And you combine that with the anecdotes from the bodybuilding community of the necessity of what they have to do. And we look up, and 10 years later, everyone thinks you eat more meals, and that actually speeds up your metabolism, increases energy expenditure. And I remember being on the bodybuilding.com forums as late as 2009 and being advised when I hit a plateau to just increase my meal frequency. And in 2007, I did that, and it made things worse because my meals got smaller. Like, I'm going to have half a protein bar at this meal, and so your hunger actually gets worse.
That's how I prepped all through the 90s because, that was kind of the belief. I remember reading that in the magazines. That's why I was eating 6 meals a day. And, I would you eat a meal, and like 30 minutes later, you're starving because the meals are so small. Yeah. But it kind of validated, like going through the actual process of a prep and, getting conditioned, getting in shape. It's like it validated those beliefs. It's like, oh, okay, that works because I'm lean, I'm muscular, I'm on stage. So, I mean, that's just one myth of many that I believed that I was kind of reading into back then.
And you're not alone. Like you said, Brad was there,
Yeah, and just like Eric said earlier, if Brad today talked to Brad back then and tried to convince him otherwise of those beliefs, that would have been a very sticky, kind of maybe even a messy conversation, just like Eric was saying earlier. You gotta be careful about how you walk around people when they have those kind of embedded beliefs, and it's reinforced through success.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about that specifically, because I think if you're listening to 3DMJ podcast and this is something like we said we were challenging more than a decade ago. So it may be that this is something that you as a listener is like, this is old news. Everybody knows you don't got to eat that frequently, and it's not. but I think you have to remind yourself that we're in somewhat of a niche community within a niche community. So there are those who might be aware of Dr. Andrew Chappell, UK champion natural bodybuilder, but also a published author. And in the same space, I've worked with him on a number of surveys that he's done. He did a 2018 survey. This is not that long ago, titled Nutritional Strategies of High-Level Natural Bodybuilders During Competition Preparation. And on average, they were consuming 6 meals per day. That's during contest prep. So this is still alive and well when we talk about the like the broader bodybuilding community. And it's something that, again, I do think logistically can make sense in the off season. So if you go into any sports nutrition text, and when I talk about sports nutrition, I'm talking about like real athletes, like not those who can get all their training done in like 6 hours a week. I mean, like some of them are training 3 to 4 hours a day. They have S&C on top of their sports practice and all that stuff. It's very easy. Like if you look at an endurance athlete, simply going through a peaking protocol, they can accidentally get into a deficit just because they can't keep up, no pun intended, as an endurance athlete. So if you look at sports nutrition texts, a very common like clinical intervention is to increase meal frequency, because that anecdotally seems to allow people to get more total food in the day. And there is some support for this. Like if you look at, there's a study by Peri-workout et al. 2016, and they found that greater hunger and desire to eat was reported by those consuming more frequent, smaller meals. So ironically, this thing that probably makes sense like in the off season, and when you look at like surveys of elite athletes by like Burke in 2003, you will see that athletes who eat more frequently consume more calories. So this thing that ironically is useful when you're trying to get down a lot of food in the off season is probably the opposite of what you should be doing in prep.
Diet.
Exactly, because these individual meals are these smaller individual meals are how you get it all down, but they're not how you stay satiated and full. So yeah, and there's been large epidemiological data sets of like population scale like evaluations that have found like weak relationships between eating more than 3 meals per day and higher BMI. So these are probably not strategies we want to leverage during contest prep. And we have like multiple studies now where we look at either metabolic health or energy expenditure, and they don't change when you increase meal frequency. So the idea that you're actually enhancing energy expenditure by increasing meal frequency, but not total calories, that is unfortunately false. I would love it to be true if this actually worked. But we have, I think a meta-analysis by Schoenfeld back in 2015. We have Rayner 2015, and we have Hutchinson and Helbron in 2016. So that is relatively established, that the whole idea of stoking the metabolic fire, not a thing, unfortunately. And if anything, you might be making hunger a little worse on a diet if you go far too high in the number of meals. So that's kind of like our upper bounds, right? We don't want to go too high. But how high is how high? And then, how low is too low? Because you can run into issues on the other end of the spectrum. And that is less clearly defined by hunger and satiety, although there is some data to suggest that too few of a meal frequency, now you're dealing with kind of the other problem. You're going too long in part of the day without eating, so you can get hungry for that reason. But I'd say what's more well established is related to protein metabolism and muscle retention and muscle building. So people are probably familiar with the intermittent fasting crowd, where you typically are eating in an 8-hour window, which kind of means you're eating 2 or 3 meals tops, if you kind of think about how you'd spread out meals over an 8-hour window. And it means that you're probably going to be awake for, another 7 to 8 hours where you're not eating. And that's not crazy. Like most people without adjusting anything, they have like a 10 to 14-hour feeding window, So 8 hours isn't nuts for some people. Like if you're just a breakfast skipper naturally, guess what? You're kind of doing IF if you don't have a snack before bed. So anyway, and so if you think about it, like we store fat as adipose tissue, right? We store carbohydrate as glycogen, and we can readily use those fuels. We can store them and use it for later. We don't really have that for amino acids, which is what we break protein down into. That is something that kind of has this constant turnover. So there is an argument for having a reasonable meal frequency. And when we look at like muscle protein synthesis studies, so like tracer studies of the kinetics of amino acids when we eat them, there is this mechanistic data that suggests that you probably want to have some kind of moderate frequency of meal consumption. Because if you go too long, you're missing an opportunity to boost muscle protein synthesis. And if you go too frequently, you get what's called this refractory period, or what's called the quote unquote muscle full effect, where if I feed you protein an hour apart, you're not going to hit that spike again. There's this quote unquote refractory period where we can't turn on the cellular mechanisms of enhancing muscle protein synthesis. Now, with that said, that's all based on these acute studies. They're tracers, they're snapshots. They don't always perfectly line up with longitudinal studies, but we understand there's a theoretical mechanism where we probably don't want to have too low of a frequency of protein, because only so much protein can get synthesized in a window. We don't have a way to store it to turn on muscle protein synthesis passively when we're not eating. And we understand there's an muscle full of fat.
Sorry to interrupt. Is there like a certain window we're talking about? Like we should be eating protein every 3 hours, every 4 hours, 5 hours? Like what's kind of that general rule of thumb that's has it been concluded, I should say?
There are some rough figures that would suggest like the muscle full effect, the refractory period lasts like 3 hours after maximally stimulating it. So that might indicate what's the maximal frequency that you'd want to eat, or that you'd want to consume protein, which would be like if you didn't sleep, 8 meals a day, and while you're awake would be like 5 or 6 meals a day, if you think about it, But here's the thing, and this is that big caveat, Jeff, of the translational research, the applied long-term research where we actually look at changes in body composition, don't match those tracer studies. And that's because these tracer studies are done in a very sanitized environment. Like, for example, there's a classic study by Arita and colleagues where only thing these folks consume for the majority of a day, this is like a 16-hour study if I recall correctly, is 80 grams of whey protein. So for one, whey protein is by far the fastest digested protein, like multiple times faster than actual things you eat. And it's also the only thing they consumed. No lipids, no dietary fat, no fiber, no carbohydrate.
That was going to be my next question. Yeah.
All these things that slow down digestion. And they change they had changed the rate of appearance of amino acids in the blood, which only has a loose relationship with the process of muscle protein synthesis. So in reality, you want to spike it every, like 3 hours. What's happening in the real world is you kind of have these very broad hills and very shallow valleys, because it's really only when you wake up first thing in the morning that you actually have a period where you don't have, exogenous amino acids present in your system that could have an impact on muscle protein synthesis. And that's probably why, Jeff, the data on actual long-term outcomes suggests, when we look at some of the studies on time-restricted feeding, which mimic the intermittent fasting crowd's practices, that there are some hints that you might get worse outcomes in terms of hypertrophy or body composition outcomes like muscle retention while dieting when you have fewer than 3 meals a day in a shorter time window. Like there's a study where they only had like a 4-hour feeding window. But once you get to that point where you're eating at least 3 meals per day, roughly evenly spreading out your protein, resistance training also occurs in the fed rather than the fasted state, which is how some of the most successful intermittent fasting studies, where they have not been outperformed by the non-intermittent fasting group, is what they do is they, at the start of their 8-hour window and the end, they have a meal, and they have one meal in the middle, or at least a protein feeding like whey, and they do that, then they work out. So if you're training in an amino acid available state, in the fed state, and you've got 3 meals, even if it's over just an 8-hour out of the 24-hour, out of the day, or for at least like 8 to 12 week studies, it doesn't seem to have an impact. It might have a slightly negative impact if we're talking like 6-month periods. And there was one recently published study that looked at, I think, at a full year of intermittent fasting that suggested it might not quite be optimal. So generally, the recommendation is, at least 3 meals a day is probably the bottom threshold. And we probably don't want to be going above 6 based on some data I've seen in terms of what might have a negative impact on hunger. Unless we're in the off season, then, if it makes you more hungry, great. Like we're trying to get a lot of calories in, unless you're someone who is sedentary, doesn't have to eat a lot to gain weight, and your natural state is, I gain weight too quickly and I need to slow it down, which is actually quite common. So anyway, I know that was kind of long-winded, but that's just an important thing, because sometimes people will only be looking at the amino acid studies, and they'll be like, we need to have a moderately high meal frequency to maximize MPS, and they ignore the longitudinal stuff. And they don't realize how weak the relationships are with MPS, just because it's a really fickle, acute measurement. It's good for understanding theory, but it's not translational research. Or some people will just be focused on the whole, stoke the metabolism thing as a myth. I was eating 8 meals a day and feeling terrible, and now I switched to IF, and 2 meals a day is great. And like that's wonderful. And yes, that was a myth, and it did create these very restrictive habits where you can't leave the home for more than 3 hours without bringing a cooler with you. But that doesn't mean there isn't some lower bounds where having at least a modicum of frequent meals, like 3 per day, isn't probably a good idea if your explicit goal is maximizing muscle mass gaining or retention of it during a diet. So yeah, and honestly, 3 to 6 meals a day should cover like most scenarios. It's rare that someone is like, 3 is way too much, or I need more than 6, unless they have like a GI issue or some very strange work hours. And in that case, then sure, I think their situation will take precedence over what the data might suggest is slightly better,
I mean, someone listening to this who's like maybe someone like myself back in the day was like, oh, I need to eat 6 meals a day to cover all this stuff. It's like, it's kind of liberating because it's almost like, well, my context now, like I'm working like 50 hours a week. I don't have time to be spending in the kitchen. I don't want to spend my entire Sunday prepping meals for an entire week. So this can be just so much more practical for someone to say, okay, you know what, I can downsize from like 6 meals now down to 3, maybe 4, free up a lot of time, take away a lot of stress, and chances are like adherence and the sustainability, but not just that, like the enjoyability factor is going to go through the roof for this particular individual. So it might have been long-winded, but I think it was super, super useful and helpful for people.
Hey 3DMJers, this is Andrea Valdez hopping in to let you know about our latest course in the 3DMJ Vault called Lagging Body Parts. It just released last month, and it's over 2 hours of video from the coaches going through the biggest to the smallest details on how to identify, address, and improve an unbalanced physique. You'll learn some quick strategic tweaks to bring up smaller muscle groups like biceps and calves, while also learning how to do full-on specialization cycles and program overhauls to address larger muscle groups that might even require a fully unbalanced program in the long term. To get access to the Lagging Body Parts course, become a Vault VIP member at 3dmjvault.com. If you're already a subscriber, this course has just been added to your student dashboard at no extra cost, and you'll now have all 14 of the courses we've ever made thus far. If you're not yet a subscriber, you can sign yourself up today at 3dmjvault.com and get everything from this new Lagging Body Parts course to the lifting library, transitioning away from tracking, prep positioning, our fat loss Q&A collection, and everything in between. Again, that's 3dmjvault.com to become a Vault VIP member and get everything we make, even courses in the future, for just $12.99 a month. Thanks so much for listening and enjoy the rest of the show.
I remember the game changer for me was when I started to look at how long does it take to digest food. Because then, like, the house of cards fell apart. Because I was holding on to this, like, you say what you will about this translational research, but my eye just keeps getting drawn to this MPS data. Like, oh, but it's been 3 hours. I could spike amino acids again. And when I started to realize that I don't just consume whey protein and nothing else in my diet, like, does that really translate to me? So there, for example, there's a great study that I like to cite by Pennings and colleagues from 2013. And they gave these folks a lean steak with 26 grams of protein. Mind you, 26 grams of protein is like a half to 1/3 of the amount of protein that's in your typical steak that you get. Like 12-ounce fucking ribeye. That's cooked 12 ounces. That means it was like 15, 16 ounces before that. Like, people eat big-ass pieces of steak, right? And they had a 6-hour study that we were watching this, and amino acid blood levels were elevated for the entire 6 hours, meaning that they might have still been elevated after that, and they're eating 1/3 or a half size of the normal steak that people eat. And that's just a steak, not consumed with carbs or fat or anything else like that, and not also considering that if you ate 4 hours ago, you're probably still digesting that meal. So as I like to say, there is a veritable conga line in your digestive tract during your waking hours of food, and then you're getting these compounding digestive effects, and gastric emptying slows the more you eat. So, like, sometimes you'll have breakfast and then you'll immediately go take a shit. Like, that's just your breakfast stimulating the dinner you had last night to start emptying your system, or maybe even lunch from yesterday. And not that that's a perfect relationship to when do you actually get elevations in blood amino acid levels, but we've got a lot of mileage of track on the inside of our bodies, and there's things being digested for a long period of time, and digestion occurs in multiple places: the mouth, the stomach, and the intestine. So I think sometimes, because we can only observe what we see as humans, like, I eat a meal, I feel this way immediately afterwards, or I have this meal frequency and I'm doing okay, so they've got to be related. But the reality is that there's a big lag time, you know? And anyone who's prepped knows this, because sometimes you only shit like every other day, you know? So digestion takes a while, is my point.
So you're making me go down a rabbit hole now, because I'm thinking like, okay, so and I know we're supposed to be talking about meal timing and meal frequency, that type of thing. But if let's say we're eating steak, chicken, like lean meats, that type of thing, poultry, things that are going to digest a little bit slower than, let's say, whey, for instance, in this example, does the amount of protein, can that differ and get maybe the same outcome? Like, let's say you're taking in 180 grams, but now you drop it down to 140 or 130, but you change the food sources and the digestion is slower. Like, what would be the outcome of that? Would there be any difference, or are we just really splitting hairs?
Jeff.
Yeah, let me and before you answer, Eric, let me kind of use a practical strategy for what Jeff is talking about, because there are I can't think of the particular religion right now, but there's a religion that practices, I think it's called Ramadan, where they're fasting during when the sun is up, right? And we have to kind of strategize around that. And so, you know, during times like that, I'll say, okay, well, if we can eat it early in the morning when it's dark, and then we can eat, you know, in the evening when the sun goes down, let's not have whey protein, you know, during those morning hours and those evening hours. Let's have something that's a little bit slower digesting, maybe even arguably a kind of a fatty fish, you know, or a fatty meat or something like that, so that we can kind of stretch out that time period of digestion. So there's just one of many contextual examples and strategies that, you know, kind of back up or you know, what Jeff is touching on that you're going to answer now, Eric.
Yeah. So there's Muslims that are adherents to Islam. There's also like Orthodox Jews or Orthodox Catholics that have like Lent or certain fasting or protocols that will, during Passover or other holidays, they'll restrict what you can eat. So it's definitely something that humans have been doing for a long time, and arguably would be forced to do this before agriculture, and especially during, say, winters in certain climates and things like that. So you're going to be okay if you fast. That's one thing to know. And there is some really interesting stuff around fasting about, you know, how, and sometimes it can even blunt hunger, like very, very low calorie diets sometimes blunt hunger more than moderate calorie diets, because your body's like, oh, I'm fasting now. Like I fully have to convert over to using my endogenous stores. That's probably not the case when you're like 8% body fat, because there's just not a lot of stores there. But you know, some interesting stuff. But unfortunately, I don't think a lot of it applies to bodybuilding. And so great points, Brad and Jeff. Going back to your question. The micromanaging protein sources is a beloved topic, especially of supplement industry funded protein studies that last only a few hours, because you can point to this rapid rise in blood amino acid levels and muscle protein synthesis when you take whey that seems to beat out slower digesting proteins like casein. However, when you don't just look at peaks, if you look at the total area under the curve, like if you think of an actual graph, and you look at a longer period of time and you compare casein, soy, whey, or whatever, and you give like an isonitrogenous, an equal amount of protein, especially if you try to match for things like essential amino acids, it all comes out in the wash. You get a larger spike in whey initially, but casein will have a longer arc, but it ends up being this very similar or non-significantly different area under the curve. So it sort of doesn't matter. Like I think once you hit that lower bound threshold of at least 3 meals per day, then all of a sudden the preceding variable that is most important is the total protein dose, you know? So a lot of the times when I give recommendations, if you read some of the more recent papers that I was a part of by like Iraqi and colleagues, or Robertson colleagues that came out in 2019 and 2020, where we gave in-season and off-season recommendations for bodybuilders, we'll go, okay, let's start from a daily intake that we know makes sense. And for our American listeners, the intakes for like the off season that we often use is like 0.7 to 1 gram per pound, which lines up with the upper end of the confidence interval from a meta-analysis I was part of that found kind of a break point around 1.6 to 2.2 grams per kg. It's like, here's probably a better safe than sorry range for your protein intake. And then we just bump it up a little bit for potentially satiety enhancing effects and maybe a slightly greater reliance on protein for fuel while dieting and while lean. And you get, our typical recommendation of around a gram per pound or slightly higher while dieting. So you start with that overall number. You make it make sense for the food sources someone has, the amount of carbs you're trying to get in and fat, so that may modulate up or down within that range, or maybe even slightly outside of it, because that's okay. And then you go, all right, what's your schedule look like? And let's distribute it across this. So I'll be like, hey, here's an example. Let's take 4 meals of 0.5 grams per kg and spread it out. And there's your 2 grams per kg off-season intake, just short of a gram per pound. And boom, we're good. So if you're a 100 kilo male, so you're 220 pounds, now you've got, 40 to 50 gram or, 35 to 50 gram protein servings 4 times a day and you're sorted, that kind of thing. So yeah, I think that's the way you work with it. You kind of work backwards if we understand that once we hit a reasonable lower level threshold, it is just like you said, and for the reasons I pointed out in those studies, Jeff, it starts to not make a difference when you're equating for the total protein intake.
So, not to make this the Eric Helms show, but I'm going to ask you a question here.
I'm enjoying this, Brad.
Second.
I don't have to talk a lot. I'm like the kid in the back of the. I'm like the kid in the back of the high school class. The teachers. You don't want to get your hand called on, so you're kind of just hiding a little bit and listening. That's. I'm enjoying this. Yeah.
And except you're asking all the questions. You're definitely calling the hand up. I see this.
Yeah, I'm kind of the kid in the front row right now. Being very inquisitive. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And luckily, I've got like you, Jeff. I've got my pen here, so I can remember the question that I'm going to ask Eric here in a second. But before I get into
notes, sitting in the front of the class, if I get an apple at the end of this podcast, I'm going to feel very, very, very teacher-like.
You're going to be, these two are such kiss asses. They got glasses in the front row. My goodness. But anyways, what I was getting at was that, okay, like this whole dissertation that you've just given us here is largely protein. It's like protein matters, right? And we all know that, and like I was saying before, like sometimes when I'm pulling information from people, I want to know, what's your protein look like in each meal? Do you have a noticeable protein source, right? But, when it comes to the other macronutrients, especially for our sport, our sport being bodybuilding, there's a lot of times when I'm trying to get somebody shredded, as I'm looking through all of my data, I'm looking at protein and calories, and I'm programming things kind of in weekly amounts. If I want this person in a 5,000 calorie a week deficit, I've got a specific weekly target that I want them to meet, and my little spreadsheet is telling me exactly what their weekly calories are, and so I'm looking at that, and I'm looking at protein, and the carbs and the fat I really don't care about. As long as those two things are being met, A, we're retaining muscle, B, we're going to drop our fat and be shredded for the bodybuilding stage, right? It doesn't really get much more complex than that. So now my question is, Eric, fat and carbs, do they matter? When do they matter? Do they matter for our sport? Kind of what, like I said, I want to make this all about the Eric Helms show and risk having you talk to the point that you're getting hoarse. You might want to get a drink of water before you start this, but do they matter?
Good question. And this is actually, so I kind of dropped this, planted a seed? Yes, that's what you do with seeds. You don't drop them. I planted a seed, clearly gardening, all the time. That's what I do. About how we do have storage form of carbohydrate and fat. So maybe the rules are different there, right? So do we need to think about carbohydrates in the same way we need to think about protein? And this is actually another murky area of research. And it's murky because the energetic demands of a sport will change your reliance on which fuel source you need, right?
Makes
so
sense.
if I wanted to be like, hey, cyclists, hey, marathon runners, it would be very easy for me to say, I've got good data to suggest you probably want a high proportion of your calories from carbohydrate, or at least a moderate proportion, like 50%, with a high calorie intake because you have a much higher energy expenditure. And triathletes, cyclists, runners, they just burn more calories than we do, right? So like if you look at high level strength athletes and bodybuilders, sometimes they approach or they're within the same kind of range of total numbers of hours per week training. Like let's say low end of a triathlete might be 8 hours a week, and then high end of a bodybuilder might be 8 or 10 hours a week. But you have to remember that's 8 to 10 hours in a triathlete of constant motion.
Right.
Motion. Yeah. Dramatically different. Yeah.
For us, if you do 3 sets of squats, each one of those sets of squats takes 30 seconds.
You rest for 5 minutes.
Yeah, but you
in my
managed
case,
to
you're
spend
resting
20
7
minutes.
minutes.
Exactly. You managed to spend 15 to 20 minutes doing the squats, but you only spent 90 seconds actually squatting. Think about that. That's 13 and a half out of 15 minutes sitting down, not doing anything.
I did a
So
post
are
on
you
this,
really-
Eric, and I added up all the time I actually trained, like the actual set time. I can't remember offhand exactly what it was, but the workout was like maybe an hour and 15 or something like that. I trained for like 5 minutes and some odd seconds.
Yeah, bro. Like if you are keeping a high work to rest ratio, it's like 80% of your time is resting. And that's with a high work to rest. You talk about some of these IPF boys and girls, I tell you what, you know, they're getting up every 5 to 7 minutes to do like 3 reps. Like, come on, you know. So at least bodybuilders, the sets last 3 times as long as a power lifter. So you're 100% right, Jeff. So it fundamentally means that you cannot put our 8 hours of training on equal footing as 8 hours of an endurance athlete. By no means. So the overall energy expenditure is lower, and the reliance and the utilization of fuel, quote unquote, right now is different. So here, there's some interesting set of studies. So big shout out to Naharudin and colleagues who did a series of studies, which I think kind of nicely encapsulates this. The first study they did came out a couple of years back, and they compared water to having breakfast and the effects on volume performance doing 4 sets to failure at 70% on squat and bench. And they found that overall, you did more total volume if you added up all the reps when you had breakfast versus having water first thing in the morning. So there's a lot of things that came together. This is after a fast, you know, breakfast, you're breaking the fast. We're talking about high rep sets, you know, 70%, that's definitely double digits. And we're talking about reasonably high number of sets per exercise. And we're also talking about demanding compound movements. So, you know, the natural assumption there is, okay, sweet, I don't want to be fasted going into my workouts, you know, get some grumbles from the IF community, but everyone else says that kind of makes sense, right? They do a follow-up study, however, and this time they compare that carbohydrate drink, water, and then a placebo drink. Well, it's actually not a drink. They made this orange sludge. So it's kind of like this like aspartame orange flavored goo versus like maltodextrin orange flavored goo. Lots of fun. I really wish I had been a participant in that study. And get this time, the placebo and the actual carbohydrate based condition beat out the water. So that's kind of wild. Now this did have like fiber in it, you know, so it was bulk, it was thickened. So what we're starting to think is the effect actually that you are using that glucose right now and, you know, saving some glycogen or making more glycogen if it was a couple hours after you ate it? Are you using glucose and glycogen? Is that what's going on? Or is there something else? And this is also followed up in another one where they compared a liquid versus a solid placebo or carbohydrate-based drink, and they found the solid did better as well. So it is something to do with actual satiety. Mm-hmm. So, you know, if anyone's been paying attention to kind of the pop science space, you've heard about like the brain-gut connection, right? And that, hey, we have a lot of these sensors everywhere, and that is true. We have oral receptors that let our bodies know that there's the presence of carbohydrate. So a tangential area of research is what's called the carbohydrate mouth rinse studying research. And this, again, is a muddied area. Generally, you see like non-significant effects on resistance training, but occasionally you see something that does favor resistance training when we're talking about more volume, longer sessions with compound movements. But most of the time, it doesn't make a difference for resistance training. But you have neutral to positive effects majority of the time when you look at like cycling. And what they're doing is they're taking like Gatorade, putting it in their mouth, swishing it around, and spitting it out. So there's consumption of 0 carbohydrates, folks. And they compare that to a like sucralose sweetened or artificial sweetener drink. So the participants and the researchers are blinded. They don't know which one you're having. Tastes the same. Both are sweet. I spit it out. And you get better performance in the one with carbohydrate. So to some degree, our body holds us back based upon its perception of our availability of energy. And there's also some It also lights up certain reward centers in the brain, so it may make you more motivated to train and have higher output. So it affects, maybe central fatigue or motivation. So the data on that Naharudin did, plus that mouth rinsing stuff, kind of suggests you don't want to be hungry going into workouts more so than you need to get a certain macronutrient ratio. However, I will say my student, Andrew King, doing his PhD on this topic specifically, we have a meta-analysis on this topic in review. So I can't spoil the plot too much, but it is most likely to get published. We've been through first round of peer review. And the findings we had suggest that while the dose is not important, if we did like a meta-regression trying to get like the dose response, what is important is, interestingly enough, the effect showing that carbohydrates enhance resistance training performance is moderated by, or it's made more apparent, and there is a positive effect with consuming carbohydrates to impact volume performance, with whether you're doing lower body versus upper body training, and for how long were you fasted beforehand. So if you did a lower body work, which it's nothing's magic about your quads. Like a squat is like a full body exercise when you think about it. It's expending more energy. And when you have been without food for longer, now it seems that eating carbohydrate makes more of a difference. So there are scenarios, and there was also a relationship with total volume in the meta-regression. So if you're doing a lot of work with a high energy expenditure and you haven't eaten for a while, all very intuitive findings when you think about it, now the fact that you had carbohydrates pre-workout does make a difference. And it might not just be, although we need more data to confirm this, the fact that you're not hungry. So in general, your peri-workout nutrition, you probably want to have protein in these meals, but primarily you just want to have something, but not something that make you full or stuffed. Like we kind of talked about earlier, you wouldn't want to go into the blood and guts workout eating 3,000 calories, or it's going to be mostly just a guts workout on the floor,
You might be bent over the garbage can. Yeah.
Yeah, you'd have a very niche audience who'd want to, watch bodybuilders throw up, but I'm sure there is a market for that on the internet because people are disgusting. Two bodybuilders, one cup. I don't know. Whatever. But I'm not
this
trying
class is getting very interesting, bro.
I don't want to yuck anybody's yum, but that's disgusting. Anyway, so the idea here is that, hey, generally, when you're doing your standard workout, you just want to think about having something. Like if in the last 2 hours you've had a meal, whether it was a banana and some whey, or that was lunch, or whether it was something else, probably doesn't make that much of a difference. Not worth kind of splitting hairs. But if you're working out first thing in the morning, maybe you do want to actually get something in so you don't feel like you're starving halfway through the workout. And it might actually matter that it contains carbohydrate. We need more research, but that's kind of where things lie right now. So great question, Brad. Sorry that took another 20 minutes. But I'd love to hear more practical applications that the coaches would think of instead of me talking about PubMed.
Well, and ultimately, it kind of sounds like your whole spew there takes me back to
no pun intended.
A very popular. very good. You programmed me there, buddy. Way to go. But it takes me back to a very popular square that I think was in the muscle and strength nutrition pyramids on how carbohydrate consumption and timing affected your different sports, cycling and bodybuilding, etc. And it really kind of sounds like when it comes to carbohydrate timing, you're really affecting more than anything performance, not necessarily getting shredded, and so that, with the practical applications to me, it's kind of like, well, you know what, let's get some carbohydrate in before your training so that we get good quality training in. But the rest of the day, just wing it kind of, if you feel like you need a little carbohydrate, make sure you don't over your calories. If you don't, I mean, shoot, I'm in a very well-fed state, and there's a lot of times I don't get more than 180 grams of carbohydrates in a day. Now, yeah, granted, 110 of that was before my training, but the rest of the day, I really didn't feel like I needed it, And so that's kind of where I was getting to why I pay less and less attention to the carbohydrate, and the fat ratios for getting people shredded on the bodybuilding stage, So yeah, that's kind of what a practical, kind of a follow-up statement, question, whatever. But, I think now it's kind of like my next question is,
Well, I didn't get to say what my practical is, Brad.
True. Yeah.
But
I better write this down or I'm going to
be
forget.
the kid in the back. All right, go ahead.
No, you go first. I'm going to write it down. As long as I write it down, I'm good.
So the way I think about it, Eric, is I think about like we'll take me for an example. Like, where am I going to need the most energy in any given day? So let's just say it's a training day, like train in the afternoons. I don't do a whole lot in the morning, but sit here at my desk. So I'm like, okay, I don't need a ton of calories early on in the day. So kind of like we talked about, okay, let me just make sure I'm getting the right amount of protein, make sure I'm dosing that first meal correctly with that. And then as far as like carbs and fats, it's a little bit more on the lower side because I'm not going to be moving a whole heck of a lot. And then I basically load up lunch because I'm like, okay, I'm going to be training around 2 or 3 hours after this. And like we talked about with digestion, I want to make sure that my lunch is fully digested before I head into training. And I don't want to feel hungry because I've actually incorrectly timed it for whatever happens. If I have to pick up my son or whatever from school, now another hour went by. Now I'm like really hungry. And in my mind, I'm like, I don't want to train because I'm hungry. So I might just say, let me just have a little granola bar, like a small 20 carb granola bar or a little bit of orange juice, and it takes the edge off and I feel fine after that. But I'm thinking, okay, 2 or 3 hours ahead of time, let me make sure I'm like, that's probably the biggest meal of the day. That's where I'm going to need the most energy for my 5-minute workout that I do. But I mean, let's face it, we're still moving heavy loads, and sometimes those sets, they do get upwards of like, 15-ish reps, sometimes 20. And I would think like, we need a decent amount of carbs to kind of fuel that. So I make sure there's ample amount of carbs heading into that training session. And then the rest of the day, I'm a little more idle. So, the last 2 meals of the day is a little more moderate in nature. But I'm kind of thinking like I'm going to split my protein pretty evenly across 4 meals. That's usually what works best for me. On occasion, it's 3. And then the carbs and fats, I kind of just be strategic about it, where I'm going to be the most active.
I love it. Yeah. I think that lines up really well with what we like, the constraints that we talked about. In the broad field we get to play with, I think that's a very logical interpretation of how to do it. So Brad, you wrote down your thing, eh?
Well, yeah, and Jeff just segued into it perfectly, whether he wanted to or not. Basically, we've talked about 2 macronutrients here, right? We've talked about protein, and like that's kind of the most important one. We've talked about carbohydrate, and it sounds like for the most part, carbohydrate for us, we want to be considerate of our training, So what about fat? Can you be too low of fat? Can you be too high of fat? Does it matter the timing of fat? In a day, fat's obviously much more calorically dense. Do we just need to kind of have a nice steady ebb and flow of fat coming in? And, does the amount of fat really even matter,
Good question. And I think, fat it digests on a slower time scale. It is stored in much greater amounts in our body. It can only fuel activity if you just look at the way that we liberate ATP from the eventual process of digesting fat and breaking it down and getting from triglycerides. It is rate limited at how quickly you can make energy from it. So really the main concerns for us are less related to nutrient timing and meal frequency, and more so just related to the overall diet quality. Like, we want to have enough fat because it does a lot of things. Like, it's a very important macronutrient in our body. It gets converted into a lot of things. Bodybuilders love to focus on the sex hormones, but it's also important for fat soluble vitamins. It is important for maintaining. It slows down digestion, like I said, so that can have an impact on satiety. And we do get important nutrients from fat itself. If you look at the data on different forms of fat and how some have positive health benefits, etc. So really, I think it's almost a function of the other macronutrients, and then just having a good overall diet setup with a good list of variety of nutritious foods. But I think if we want to look at having more even energy throughout the day, promoting adherence, essentially, like you guys have talked about, you're going to have a relatively even intake of protein, and then you're going to kind of like auto-regulate around training your carbohydrate intake. So you want to basically have fat be the flip side of your carbs to have a more even intake throughout the day. Unless you're someone who likes to have one big meal, and that's fine. Like I tend to eat relatively small meals until dinner and have a larger dinner. So that tends to be higher in carbohydrate and fat. But that also just fits my kind of natural diurnal cycle of when do I get hungry. Like I'm not hungry in the early part of the day. So I don't need to worry about, I had a low carb meal, so I need to have a high fat with it, or vice versa, to make sure I'm not hungry, because I'm just not going to be hungry regardless unless I'm dieting. So, which changes everything. So I think the general answer there is it's more about just having an appropriate overall intake of fat, and then just distributing it throughout the day that considers those two factors. What's the calorie content from carbohydrate and protein, and and then when is your general time scale for when you're hungry and you would like to eat more, and then you can distribute your fat in that manner. But it's not something that we need to worry about too much as far as the timing of. One thing I will say on this topic, though, and this is something that I did a lot as a coach back in the day, was during prep, sometimes you just have to tell your athlete to kind of take the L on not trying to go into their workout. Like I said, like ideally you don't want to go into a workout hungry, because that can have a negative impact on training. And I think there was this prevailing thought like, hey, I want to retain muscle, so I need to make sure that I'm not feeling like shit going into my workout, so I'm going to really load up in that pre-workout window. And when your calories just do this, they just kind of nosedive throughout prep generally. Like you're going to have some periods like, I did a diet break and I kept losing, so I just didn't keep, and so I bumped my calories and kept them there or whatever, or you might eat up or whatever. But generally, once you're shredded, your calories are pretty damn low. So if you try to preserve an off-season level, or sometimes even compensate and eat more than you did in the off-season as a pre-workout meal, that may make sense at face value if you're too focused just on the quality of your workout, but boy, does the rest of the day get hard. You start to just be constantly hungry, and all you think about is that pre-workout meal. And it kind of is this like self-fulfilling prophecy. You're really, really hungry, and then you get to your pre-workout meal and you're like, I want to load it up. And the justification is because I want to have a good training session. And I've even had people who are on like 2,000 calorie diets and they're eating 1,200 calories before they train. And I'm like, bro, you need to chill out with that, because you're making this way harder for every other, time point in the day. So I think you probably do want to have some limits. And like I said, like during prep, there's going to be a certain point where you're just kind of always hungry a little bit. And it's just like degrees of hunger. And maybe you don't want to have your highest degree of hunger while you're training, but you kind of just have to accept it and take the L instead of trying to compensate for that. So that is one little piece of nuanced advice that I can add to what you guys are saying, is that during prep specifically, you may not get the benefit of trying to leverage what we know about the mechanisms by which a meal can enhance performance. You don't get to blunt hunger at a certain point. You could blunt it a little or acutely, but it's just gonna, yeah.
I think from an adherence standpoint too, like some people will like basically undereat the entire day, regardless of where their training's at. They're like, I'm just going to undereat so I can have this one big grandiose meal while I'm watching the Food Channel on the couch at night. And, they kind of wonder why, like, their energy levels are very erotic. Did I just say erotic?
Ooh,
See?
yeah. I have erotic energy levels.
Neurotic.
Erratic.
See, I need more carbs because I'm dieting. See that? Maybe I need to swish my mouth with some aspartame.
We know how you feel about carbs.
Yeah,
and
but no,
it's an erotic experience.
Like people go through the whole entire day just so they can save themselves for this one big meal, and then they're just like hungry through the day. Their energy levels are not really good. And if you're someone who has to work through that, like a normal job, and you're brain fogged, it's probably not the best thing to do. So I think a lot of times, like just having balance. Like you go back to the bros, right? Like, hey, we eat these 6 meals. I'm not saying eat 6 meals, but if you're eating 3 or 4 and they're fairly evenly balanced, then your satiety and your energy levels probably will be a little bit more balanced out. And it's probably a better place to kind of, prep through or diet through or whatever the case may be.
Jeff,
yeah,
well
and Eric, I'm really glad that you brought up that whole malnutrition thing, because if I recall correctly, I heard of that piece of evidence through mass, I'm pretty sure. And I remember I did try that with a few athletes, in addition to your pre-workout meal, I don't want you having 1,200 calories for your pre-workout meal when you're only getting 1,500 calories a day. I want you to have something more reasonable. But, I'm just going to have you, just have some G2 or something like that, and some sort of very, very light, carbohydrate drink, but don't swallow it, just rinse it around, spit it out, rinse it around, spit it out, and I got away from that. That's my 50-and-a-half-year-old brain, I guess, forgetting
Can you get
that little strategy, but what do you think? Is that something that it seemed like it worked, if I recall correctly, especially in small individuals? It seems like it was a really small individual I was utilizing that with, that was getting by on really low calories, like 1,000 or less.
I would assume like chewing a piece of gum or a breath mint or something like that, would that have probably similar effects, you think? Or
it's got to have carbs in it. So I think that is the. So here's a couple things: is on balance, it is the minority of studies that for resistance training show a benefit. Just remember that. So we shouldn't have high expectations of this.
Gotcha.
And they're placebo controlled, right? So one, and I'm not going to be mad about this, but one, benefit or shortcoming of our confidence in this is that when you have a client try this, they might just be getting the placebo effect. Great, fantastic. I have no issue with that.
Exactly what I was thinking. Yeah.
Right, because we don't have the version of them in another reality, or their twin who did not get to do it, or who tried it with this, what is it, Powerade Light, that is just no carbs, right? But tastes sweet. So that doesn't really matter. What matters is, did it work? And I think this is a low to no risk strategy. So if your carbs are getting low, if you're noticing your energy levels are tanking in your workouts, your workouts are probably more representative of the higher volume mouth rinsing research that is more likely to show a benefit anyway. So it's worth a shot. And what you would do is you just basically between sets or between exercises, doesn't have to be a whole lot, you just swish your mouth with Gatorade, have it in there for 30 seconds, and then spit it out. People might think you're gross. Don't do it in the water fountain. It might look a little weird with you running to the bathroom over and over again. So I mean, do think about the logistics of this. Don't be disgusting. Don't piss people off. But they might. And if you spit it back into the bottle, and you're backwashing constantly, I guess it's your own spit. There's some logistical things to consider, but I think it's basically a no risk strategy.
We're talking context of let's say contest prep, where we're in a pretty good deficit. So my thought would be, before going around swishing your mouth, let's kind of look at the bigger picture, take a big step back, and make sure the deficit isn't too invasive. You're getting enough sleep. Maybe you need more recovery days, that type of thing.
Mm-hmm.
I would probably look at that before I would resort to just swishing my mouth. Or I was just bringing the question of breath mints and gum. Is there any difference? Not so much, hey, let's go out and chew a pack of gum before we train.
I mean, you like most preppers are getting sugar-free gum or whatever. You could, if you want to work in, I don't know, you just need to start tracking it. If you start having 3 pieces of gum during your workout, what is that? 8-10 grams of carbs? I have no idea. I don't chew gum. But it's just something to keep in mind, and that may be worth it, having 10 grams of your carbs from gum during your workout. And to be clear, to get the benefits of a mouth rinse, you don't have to not swallow it. You know what I'm saying? Like if you swallow, it's not going to take away the benefit from swallowing it, like the juice from the gum or actually swallowing it, but it is probably calories that you'd prefer have from a solid source, So, but yeah, I agree, Jeff. If you're really seeing energy tanking in a workout, my first line of defense would not be let's do some Gatorade swishing. It would be let's think about meal structure, training structure, how much volume are we doing? Maybe we need to train day of or day after refeeds, et cetera, to try to preserve that performance without doing something like that. But it is definitely something I think is available to us as one of our many batterings in the bat belt. Okay, so I've got one other comment, and Jeff, I think you'll like this one. So once the data started coming out that would suggest, hey, increased meal frequency does not enhance the metabolism, and hey, how we distribute our meals has this broad set of ranges that are all probably equally fine for the mean response for people. The evidence-based meme that was a little more popular, like say 5 years ago or longer, was meal timing doesn't matter. You guys have probably heard that one. Like meal frequency is irrelevant, or it's just personal preference. Now, I think what people are forgetting is that when you see a study compare two things and they have non-significant differences between each other, the one thing they both share is a structured provision of a protocol, right? So both groups are being assigned something that they're trying to adhere to, and they're being, like if it's an RCT, here's your 3 day, three meals per day plan, here's your 6 meals per day plan, go forth and do it. What neither group is getting is a none of this matters, I'm just going to eat whatever I want so long as if it fits your macros. So if that is your take home from the research, you're doing something that has not been researched, which at least not in controlled studies, which is just like, meal frequency nihilism, like just whatever, I don't give a shit. So I think what there is some data to suggest, both in terms of weight loss maintenance, like if we look at some of the registries of people who successfully lost weight and kept it off, and if we look at some limited small effect and a couple studies I can think of having like a regular meal pattern, there's potential benefits to just having structure, so long as it's within this kind of world of relatively broad guidelines. And I remember the mistake I made that I don't think helped me develop good bodybuilding habits early on was when the if it fits your macros craze became apparent to me. Was I literally just like changed my meals and foods and all that stuff on like a day-to-day basis, and I really had no structure. And I think that was probably one of the reasons why I struggled so much with getting too heavy in the off season, is I just didn't have any type of like regularity or structure with my eating. And since that's changed, I have to more so intentionally have to eat more and eat more or less satiating foods to gain weight. And that's a place I'd rather be personally, is not always struggling not to get too heavy in the off season and potentially making my contest prep harder, but knowing like, I'm not gaining weight and I wanted to at this rate, let me include more eating out or add more quote unquote treats or increase my meal frequency like we talked about, rather than constantly trying to hold back this onslaught of body fat in the off season, So I attribute that somewhat to thinking about this more from a qualitative kind of structure perspective, rather than, let's just hit macros and nothing else matters. So I think that's something that people should think about.
I was kind of, I don't know, maybe opposite. Like back when I first started, it was like you talked about earlier, like being super rigid can be counterproductive. And that was kind of my case. Like during contest prep, I had a lot of structure and a lot of, there's a lot of rigidness to it. So eating certain foods, eating certain time, number of meals, like everything was very robotic, which, I mean, I was successful doing it. But then once the show's over with, you cross the finish line, I had no tools after that to kind of cope with like real world situations. And it was almost like, what do I do here? So handcuffs come off, and now all of a sudden there's no structure. It's pizza here, it's burgers there, it's ice cream here. And before you know it, you're rebounding and you're just kind of spiraling out of control. So I think, when we work with athletes, initially it's like, yeah, there needs to be, a foundation and structure put in place. And it might look rigid in the early stages until they learn some skills. But then eventually you need to learn and work with a bunch of different types of tools so you can get a lot more flexible and you can make good decisions in the moment. Because we're not robots. We're always going to have like certain different type of circumstances pop up, and if you don't have enough knowledge and education and tools at your disposal to use, you're kind of like me. You're just like handcuffed, and it's like, what do I do here? And chances are you make the wrong decisions.
Yep.
So there needs to be structure and there needs to be flexibility built within it. That's where you kind of have that middle ground area where we all like to work in.
Yeah, because we talked about that in a previous podcast. I think it was a long time ago, where it's kind of like we want to kind of have our off season and our preps kind of look somewhat similar, and we have this. We kind of maintain some semblance of structure all the time, but we're never to that point to where we're eating the same foods at the same times every single day. And then on the flip side, we're never going into the kitchen going, "Wow, what am I going to eat?" What fits my macros? What sounds good? And like Jeff, kind of experienced which I have experienced before. It's like, I don't have any tools now, and you almost kind of, you get this food analysis or food paralysis by analysis, you know what I mean? So yeah, I a lot of times, if it's deep in the off season, I'm like, let's have a couple of our meals look very, very similar throughout the day. And then the other two have a little bit of variety with, maybe just our sources of protein or our sources of carbohydrate. And then of course, when we get into competition prep, well, now we're going to have to be a little bit more rigid. We might have to have 4 similar meals or 5 similar meals throughout the day and narrow each of those meals down to where some of those might be very, very much the same for a short period of time. And then the other side, when we're way deep in the off season, we might just not want to think about food too much and just say, okay, well, you know what? I need to have a noticeable amount of protein with each of my meals and leave each of my meals with a nice food baby after, each of my meals. And that's really the extent of our structure. But at least they look similar, I
think you wrote that, the default diet, Eric, the article on that, and that right there, I think sums up exactly kind of what Brad's kind of talking about.
I think that's what's speaking in the back of my little 50-year-old pea brain here.
So that's probably a good reference for listeners to kind of check out, would be to read up on Eric's article.
Yeah, I think that's a really good one that kind of illustrates the structural similarities between the in-season and the off-season that you want to work towards, but the obviously energetic and even macronutrient differences and that intake. And I find it's a really great way to how to conceptualize this, and it gives you something to fall back on when like those handcuffs come off. And there's almost no avoiding it, like contest prep diets, even with an element of flexibility, become rigid just because you're limited on numbers and you're hungry and you want to eat and you are physically starving. So that is always compensated for. You're going to swing back on the other side. And it is no surprise that actually, Jeff, you said kind of the opposite for you. That's the same as me, because I remember during my 07 prep where I gained like nearly 50 pounds afterwards, I had an extremely rigid diet. And then in the off season, it was just like party time. And it was the inverse of how restricted I felt. And I think that's a very common experience that anyone who's competed can relate to. So the reason why we try to make some more similarities there, if you come from a very hardcore prep background, that sounds scary as hell. Like, oh my God, I can't make my off seasons more like that. But the issue is also that you're too restrictive in your contest prep diet. So getting more flexibility there and then more structure in the off season. And then those are skills you work on like season to season to season, like over multiple years, which is what I did as a bodybuilder, to where I'm more structured in the off season, but I'm more flexible in prep. And those two things are getting a little more qualitatively similar. And I think that's encapsulated pretty well in that article that Jeff referenced. And thanks guys. I'm glad that was a well-received article. I think it'll be helpful to the listener. Well, shit, I think we did it. I think we covered a lot of ground there, team. I really appreciate your guys' insights. You were excellent students. Glasses on. Brad's taking notes. Front of the class. I expect a really good review on rateyourprofessors.com. And I know that neither one of you will be actually going on rateyourprofessors.com because of the, let's say, the older population class that I have today. Maybe you're not familiar with that website, and that's okay. But we'll talk about how to use the internet next time in the class by Dr. Helms.
The only website address I know is 3dmusclejourney.com.
And that, listeners, is the only website you need to know either. So we'll see you next time. Thank you for your time. What's going on, 3DMJers? Eric Helms here. Thanks for listening to our podcast. I just want to take a second to tell you about MASS, Monthly Applications in Strength Sport. This is a monthly research review that I put out with Greg Nuckols, Dr. Mike Zerdos, and Dr. Eric Trexler. We cover the most up-to-date, peer-reviewed research in the world of strength and physique sport that's directly relevant to your practice as a coach or an athlete. We provide our reviews in written format, but also, since you enjoy our podcast, in audio roundtable reviews where we discuss the research in depth. Finally, we also do video concept reviews where we cover a broader topic in video format for your learning. For fitness professionals, you can take quizzes on MASS content and earn continuing education credits for most of the biggest certifying bodies in the fitness industry. If you want to sign up and get a subscription, head over to 3dmusclejourney.com and click on the products tab. Thanks for your time, and thanks for listening.